Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion about an area for which I have a great passion, innovation. Specifically, how to take a fantastic idea and get that idea to the markets that are waiting for it, the challenge of commercialization. And in the area of climate innovation, we know that those markets are eager to embrace pathways that will move us toward our global emissions reduction goals. I'm very excited about our expert panel this evening, and I want to welcome Dr. Vanessa Chan, the Chief Commercialization Officer and Director of the Department of Energy's Office of Technology Transitions, Tim Harris, CEO and Managing Director of Redflow Limited, and Dr. Linda Mullen, Program Director at the National Science Foundation's Convergence Accelerator. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Amy Harder, who is the editor of Cipher, the online magazine produced by Breakthrough Energy, Bill Gates' clean energy venture. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and I look forward to your insights and analysis. This evening's discussion is very relevant to Australia and our bright thinkers. We're both an innovative, highly educated nation that values new ideas and future thinking. Australian investment and innovation are creating jobs in the US and supporting the clean energy transition. Earlier this month, the CEO of Australian-founded Tritium joined President Biden to announce a new manufacturing facility in Tennessee. The facility will produce up to 30,000 electric vehicle chargers per year and create 500 great local jobs. The Australian government's $250 million Future Fuels Fund is supporting the growth of companies like Tritium. With dynamic links between our academic, industry, and public sector research institutions, Australia welcomes investment in its intellectual capital to lay the groundwork for future discoveries. And this is an especially exciting time as we start to open up again after a devastating pandemic. We're excited to welcome tourists, business travellers, and international students back to our country. Australian universities are globally renowned, and the quality of their education builds our world-leading talent. Today, 7 Australian universities rank in the world's top 100, and spending on education exceeds the OECD average. And we're a magnet for global talent. From medicine to IT, highly skilled professionals are drawn to world-class institutions across the country. They bring skills that help build Australian businesses, science, and technology prowess in the region and around the world. This contributes to our globally competitive workforce. Australia's scientific publication scores are among the world's highest, and so are its metrics for critical thinking in teaching. And we know that diversity is our strength. In 2019, Australia had the 3rd highest proportion of foreign-born citizens among OECD countries. That's twice the average for the OECD. We're committed to supporting a world-class infrastructure that promotes innovation, and we rank as one of the highest global investors in R&D. Not to mention, Australia scores highly for digital skills across regional and global digital readiness rankings. As you can tell, this evening's topic is near and dear to me. As a former Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, I'm tremendously proud of Australia's status as a global leader in these areas. But there's always room for improvement. There's more that can be done. And I feel lucky to have the chance to learn from these American and Australian experts on how we can continue to foster innovation and commercialization. Thank you to G'day USA for organising this discussion, and to the American Australian Association for hosting. And thanks to our teams at the Embassy in Washington and the Consulate in LA for their work on bringing this all together. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the Ambassador for those great comments, and to everyone for joining today. It is certainly a dark day with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but climate change is the type of problem whose impacts and solutions play out over decades and centuries. So it's so important that we are meeting today to discuss how innovation in new technologies will help us reach net zero emissions and greater energy security. And in fact, as the Ambassador mentioned, I'm the executive editor of Cipher. It's a new publication by Breakthrough Energy where we're covering all of these important topics and the technological transformations that we will need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. You can sign up at ciphernews.com. Australia and the United States have been at the forefront of developing low-emission technologies. And this comes despite challenging politics in both countries around climate change for many years. And this leadership on these types of technologies is a big reason why I visited Australia in 2019 and visited both a coal export terminal, but also a wind farm, and talked to clean energy executives around the country. And it's why I'm thrilled to be leading this conversation today. And as the ambassador mentioned, I would love to be among those visiting Australia again after the pandemic. So we'll have a conversation among the panelists for most of the hour, and then reserve time at the end for a couple of questions that we received pre-submitted from the audience. And so each of the panelists will have just a couple of minutes to introduce themselves further from what the ambassador had mentioned, and then we'll dive into questions. Vanessa, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Vanessa Chan, the Chief Commercialization Officer and the Director of the Office of Technology Transitions here at the Department of Energy. Our congressional mandate is to drive commercial impact from all the investments being made across the Department of Energy, which includes 17 national labs in the United States. We define commercialization as moving a product from an idea from the lab all the way through the research, development, demonstration to deployment. So RD&D continuum in order to make it to market. And as the steward of the RD&D continuum, we're working hard to ensure that we are driving to that commercial impact. And recently, you may all have seen that we had the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law passed, which was $62 billion. And we're looking at ways that we can use that to really buy down risk so that we can end up activating the $23 trillion in the private sector. And so I'm excited to be here in the role and helping to drive commercialization, have more impact in order to meet our climate goals in the world. Thank you, Amy.
Great, thanks so much, Vanessa. Tim, why don't we go to you?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Tim Harris. I'm the CEO and Managing Director of Redflow. Redflow is an ASX-listed company that's focused on energy storage. And I think we all know on this call, energy storage really sits at the heart of enabling a renewable-based future for us. We're a company that is focused on flow batteries, a particular type of battery called a zinc bromide flow battery. And we're really the industry leaders in our field around this. And flow batteries have a number of different characteristics, from lithium batteries, including recyclability, being very safe, and have a long discharge. They're really suited towards the medium to longer term energy storage duration. The US is very key to our strategy going forward, and we've just launched a reference 2 megawatt hour project in California. So we're very excited about the opportunities in the US market, and I'm very excited to join this panel today.
Great, thanks so much, Tim. Linda, let's go to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Linda Mullen. I'm a program director at the U.S. National Science Foundation for the Nsf Convergence Accelerator. The U.S. National Science Foundation is an $8 billion plus U.S. federal agency that broadly supports all areas of science and engineering for the health and welfare of the American people. We recognize what an incredible moment in time this is, with intensity of global competition, the need for talent, and to solve big problems like climate change. The Nsf Convergence Accelerator is a program within the National Science Foundation that was launched specifically to focus on these unmet societal needs. It's a disruptive way of doing things. We normally at NSF fund only the fundamental research, and now what we're trying to do is galvanize that community of investment in fundamental research around transitioning that to practice for meaningful solutions to solve these big and urgent problems. We proactively manage our teams that we fund in the Convergence Accelerator so they can work at speed and scale. We help them develop diverse partnerships. We encourage them to both cooperate and compete, and provide intensive education and mentorship program, including coaches for the teams, for the PIs, to help them on this journey towards commercialization. I'm really excited because the timing to talk to you today is just perfect. We have announced publicly by dear colleague letter NSF 22-036, we have 3 upcoming tracks for the Convergence Accelerator. The full solicitation should be made public within a few weeks. So please keep an eye on our website. I have the link at the bottom of the slide. I want to draw particular attention to Track I, Sustainable Materials for Global Challenges, because that was developed in cooperation with CSIRO in Australia and led to the first ever memorandum of understanding between the National Science Foundation and CSIRO. So we're very excited about that. That is open such that through that collaboration and MOU, Nsf can directly fund lead principal investigators from Australia. And as usual, though, our other tracks that you see here, H and J, are always open to international partners that collaborate with the lead US institution. Thank you for your time. I'm excited to tell you more about that program.
Great, thanks so much, Linda. So for my opening question, I want to really kind of go big picture and reference a highly cited report by the International Energy Agency that recently found about half of the world's emissions reductions will need to come from technologies that aren't yet commercially available at scale. So therefore, significant investment will be needed to scale up the production of these technologies that are being developed. And maybe, Vanessa, we'll go to you first, but would love to hear from the whole panel on this question. What role should governments play here, and how is that balanced with private sector investments?
Yeah, so I think the role of governments is really important because, we have the opportunity to really activate, especially in the case of the US, right? A lot of the research and development that is being done across our nation. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have 17 national labs that are at the forefront, really the crown jewels of the United States, of the kinds of research that we're doing that are so critical to make us at the front edge of technology. And so as a US government, we spend a lot of dollars against that. And these have really allowed us to be competitive in the marketplace with the types of innovations that all of us are now using. And so I think that is one of the important roles that we're playing. And I think secondly, we are able to invest in things that the private sector may think are a little bit more on the risky side. And so by doing that, we're able to work on things that are not quite there yet for the private sector, but when it gets there, they can then take over. And so I think that role is super critical. If we didn't have that, then I think we would be back in the Stone Ages for a lot of the things that we're doing.
Certainly. Tim, I would love to hear from your private sector investment, kind of what are you looking to from governments in order to ramp up a business like yours?
Well, I think the space that we operate in is all about scale. If you look at the deployment of energy storage around the world, about over 90% of that is in the lithium-based space that's had billions of dollars of investment in R&D to get to a point where they've been able to reduce the cost of those lithium inputs by 90% over 10 years. We're really at the start of that curve. And for us, we now have a really strong track record of deployments now in the US, but also overseas. But it's all about scalability, and it's proving the technology at an industrial scale that proves to our customers and other stakeholders that ours is a technology and a solution which is robust and is worthy of kind of further deployment. And so our 2 megawatt hour system that we've deployed in California has been supported by the Californian Energy Commission, and their ability to kind of look beyond the current day environment and look into the needs of the future as we try and reach those Paris Agreement goals, but as you try and address some of those other dynamics that I think the US and Australia are grappling with, energy security. What do we do about recycling and the environmental impact of different uses of materials? So we're not solving today's problem, but causing another one tomorrow. And so as we look forward, some of the activities by the DOE at the federal level, the infrastructure bill that is progressing, but also at the state level at the US, we really find a great drive to encourage new technologies to come forward. And when you couple that with a very vibrant investment community looking at green energy and green tech in the US, we think it's a very exciting period. But we would emphasize that the role of government and the DOE to kind of cross that chasm around scale up, cost down, competitiveness is incredibly important. And so, we're very excited in the US about some of these initiatives and what we see ahead of us going forward.
That's great. Linda, you sort of, bridge the divide between a lot of these different players. Can you talk about how you see the role of government and private sector investment?
I look at it in a similar way to Vanessa, and we love collaborating with DOE and utilizing the amazing resources of our national labs. What I would add is a little bit of perspective around the fact that when we talk about federal government funds, they're public funds. And so rather than de-risking for a market that already exists, so that a lot of the markets that already exist may not be in the place that we want them to be in, or creating materials that pollute the earth, plastics, et cetera. We see the opportunity for government funds to come in those early stages of fundamental and use-inspired research and to help researchers be transformative. And so you might, at a broad brush, think, what does track I, sustainable materials, have to do with climate change? Well, actually, this is an effort to actually mitigate, prevent that climate change, not just developing technology to clean up, what's already happening to the climate or deal with that, those circumstances. So that's where I really see the opportunity. How can we partner with the private sector to help fund the technology to a stage where it's already been transformed onto a path that's more sustainable, and then the private sector can take it and scale. And because NSF has historically funded primarily fundamental research, I see us sort of right at that juncture, that critical handoff, when you're seeing if something's ready to start moving down that translational pathway.
Great, Linda, I want to start with you for this next question as well. We all know the cliche chicken and egg scenario, and we're seeing that play out a lot in the energy space. So how do you make sure that we don't get into a chicken and egg scenario where we have enough end uses and demand for clean energy, but at the same time that we actually have the supply of those new technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a careful balance between, again, exactly this transition point of when you're taking that fundamental science and constantly assessing and reassessing product market fit for what you're developing. The NSF I-Core program that was developed based on Steve Blank's Lean Launchpad methodology is an example of that. I think that can be used at any point in the translational pathway to explore further how the technologies can be developed and make sure that there's that fit for how that they would be used. So I think it's more about building the ecosystem, the whole ecosystem, and understanding it.
Great, Vanessa, what's the U.S. government's perspective on sort of managing this chicken and egg scenario?
I think first of all, it's the emu and the egg, given the audience that we have right now. But this is a really great question, and it really hits on a challenge that I'm grappling with every day. And I will talk about anyone who will listen to me about this one. Is that as we think about commercialization, I talked about this continuum, which we're moving from research to demonstration development to deployment. And it's a really complex continuum that there's a lot of interrelationships and interdependencies. And it's also a very long and tortuous journey, right, from the idea to the store shelf. And so when we're thinking about this, we really need to think about the context of what does the market actually need? And we need to get alignment and connection from the broader ecosystem with our researchers and scientists. And so it's something where oftentimes, researchers and scientists may be focused on the technology solution, right? But that's not enough in order to get us to full-scale deployment. And so we have to really understand what is the existing solution today. What is the cost parity to the existing solution for this new technology? And do we have what it takes to convince every single player in the value chain to switch to this new solution, which oftentimes requires a lot of work? And so it's important to understand the market, to understand the techno-economic analysis behind the new solutions that you're going to. And really what I'm trying to do here at OTT is making sure that we're addressing adoption of the market risk earlier. So market adoption risk is something that too often we forget about. We focus on technology milestones, and the market adoption risk actually can be the thing that's holding it back. And so if you're able to work on the market adoption risk early, while you're working on the technology adoption risk, that really helps us avoid the emu and the egg, because you're very early on talking to the market to understand what's the pathway you need. What is it that you need to see for something to be commercially viable? And if we start assessing those commercialization pathways as soon as we can, then we will be more successful in actually getting something all the way to market.
Are you basically saying that you're trying to minimize the market adoption risk?
I would say minimize it. I would say you want to be explicit about it. It's like, the first thing is recognizing it even exists. And the question is, what is the market adoption risk? And so right now, I've been doing a lot of work at the Department of Energy of actually codifying in a systematic way, what are the different types of market adoption risks out there, and assessing our technology against it. And then what you need to then say is, okay, if we've now thought about there's regulatory risk, there's safety risks, there's things around the economic risk of it, right? And the business model risk. And then you say, okay, why is something high risk right now? And are there actions I can take by working with the ecosystem to try to drive down those risks, right? Ultimately, if you want to get to deployment, you need low market risk, you need low technology risk, but not all solutions can be dropped into a market. So we need to work with the ecosystems to ask ourselves, what do we need to do to actually get our technology commercialized and work together to get there? And not one single organization can do that on their own.
I think that's great. So often risk is seen as a black or white issue or something bad that you need to shy away from, but you just need to manage it and be aware of it because it's never going to go away, right, in the world that we live in. Tim, I'd love to take that question to you on the chicken and egg. I mean, certainly energy storage is one where you're going to need it as soon as renewables grow to a certain point, but you need to make sure it's there before renewables are, 70, 80% of any electricity grid.
Yeah, look, and I think from our perspective, echoing what Vanessa and Linda have said previously, you've got to first start with the intent, and if you have the intent and a plan that's clearly mapped out about your priority areas, that can align many stakeholders, across the value chain, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And, I would applaud the Australian government's, technology investment roadmap that clearly outlines energy storage as a priority and clearly outlines that they intend to co-partner with the private sector to achieve those goals. And we were delighted to be cited in that recent report. But I think, when you start to get across that kind of value chain and into that commercialization path, it is all about de-risking the process at different stages as you go through that value chain to commercialization. But I think the other point I would say is, while people often have intent, it's often the friction that you find of introducing new ideas to an ecosystem that really that is managing critical infrastructure, both in the private sector and the public sector. And from our perspective, companies that do this really well often recognize that there's different pathways to introduce and test and trial new technologies across the ecosystem in a way that can be managed before it's introduced into the wider environment. And that's very important for us. And we've seen, I think, forward-looking companies starting to see their own intent, whether it's their shareholders or their constituencies in places like California, and actively starting to plan beyond this, the next kind of 2 or 3 years, looking at 5 years, 10 years, et cetera, to where we need to go. And then starting to map programs and pathways along that line to encourage companies and innovations to kind of make it through that process. And that's really important. And we think, when we look to the US, we see some really cohesive means and mechanisms for that to occur. And just, I suppose, echoing Linda's point as well, is even when you've got a technology like ours, where we've been working at this for the last 15 years, our ability to incrementally improve on that technology at the raw base chemistry type level, there's still huge opportunity there. So, once you're in that kind of commercialization path, you can't stop innovating, even at the core level. And that's something that, we continue to do, and we have to do, and that's going to drive eventual great outcomes for our customers, but also for our shareholders.
That's great. One thing I love about this event is, we're really covering the globe. I'm joining you from Seattle, Washington in the afternoon on Thursday. It's Friday already where Tim is and probably a lot of our audience. And I know, Vanessa, you're in DC. Linda, I think you're probably on the East Coast, if I had to guess.
DC,
yeah,
at the moment.
And, this is just one, the US-Australian relationship is just one example of the types of collaboration that will be needed to address climate change. A big part of our mission statement at Breakthrough Energy and Safer is that we need to reduce the cost of technologies around the entire world in order to combat climate change, because we're all on this planet together. So to direct this question first to Vanessa, but would love to hear from the whole panel, is can you talk about the importance of collaboration across countries to commercialize technologies, and how is the energy department participating in that?
Yeah, so climate change is clearly global. Climate is a global phenomenon. It doesn't, sit within one country. And I think in 2022, I think it goes without saying, right, that international collaboration is a really key reality that we can't ignore. And it's going to be an important component of anything we're doing to commercialize technologies. And there's some really obvious reasons why this is true, right? If someone in Australia has the money they want to invest in a product in the US, this is something to talk about, right? So funding and investment dollars is a huge one. And another obvious one is talent, right? We just heard from the Australian ambassador, right? The amounts of skill and work that's there in Australia. And we have a lot of benefits from the US if we can bring scientists and researchers across the globe so that they can pollinate their ideas and their research, right, into our ecosystem and vice versa. So the more we have talent and collaboration flow going back and forth, the better off we are. And it goes deeper though than money and just people. And I think a lot of this is around best practices. I lived in Germany for 2 years. And while I was there, my perspective on so many things changed, including my own lifestyle and how I handle recycling. So if you ever live in Germany, you'll know you have to sort your recyclables. You actually have to buy your, trash bags and buy your recycling bags. And there's actual barcodes where they scan, and it's actually linked to your address, so they know if you're not recycling or if you're not doing compost. And so if you don't do this, they scan it, you will get fined. So if they find recycling in your trash, you will get a personal fine for this. And so this is an example of, a country that, has led to people really learning about recycling and what to do. And so this makes you think about, regulation rules and how do people live in different places. And, given what I've learned in the international community, how do I personally do things differently? So I think, we have to go from the individual level for a lot of this to a broader level, which is the US federal government and the initiatives that we have here at the DOE to advance international efforts and really trying to move technologies to market to address climate change. So example of this is a Net Zero World. I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but it's an initiative that aims to accelerate global energy system decarbonization by partnering with specific countries to create very tailored, actionable technology roadmaps and investment strategies. Another example is our participation in Mission Innovation, which is a global initiative catalyzing a decade of action and investment in research, development, demonstration to really lead to clean energy that's affordable, attractive, and accessible to everyone. And across our government, we're supporting other initiatives such as the First Movers Coalition and the Clean Energy Demand Initiative that's really engaging industry to provide demand signals to help emerging clean technologies accessible and scalable. And of course, we've shown a great interest in partnerships and collaboration with our commitment to international efforts, such as COP26 this past year and the UN Climate Change Conference. So on all levels, personal for myself, industry or technology specific, and on a national level, I really do believe that collaborations across countries is super, super critical.
That's great. Certainly, most of us have room for improvement in our recycling habits. That's something I personally need to get better at. So I appreciated that anecdote. Linda, can you talk about how your program crosses over into different countries and why that type of collaboration is important?
Absolutely, it's critical for us. Many people don't know we have an Office of International Science and Engineering at NSF. We have colleagues who collaborate and partner broadly all around the world. We work together funding workshops and go through ideation processes, develop solicitation topics like I told you about with the sustainable materials topic. And I would say that what's fascinating is, a lot of what Vanessa also said, you work with other countries and cultures, you see how things are done differently. It can really open your eyes to how things can change in your own country. And we're really asking a lot of people to do with climate change and recycling and the pandemic is behavior change. And so when you see examples of how other countries have accomplished this, I think it's really, really important to look at. We're particularly excited to work with Australia because I think sometimes on a smaller scale, when something's implemented, then you can see where maybe there are parts of the United States where we could implement that, and similarly for Germany and other countries. So, so it's really at the core of what we do, and we also do a lot of international collaboration, not just in implementation, but in the real fundamental science and working on that together.
That's great. Tim, I want to turn to you. The regulatory environments in Australia and the US have some similarities, but also many differences. As a company with a footprint in both systems, what would you say are the synergies and where are the greatest challenges and room for improvement?
Look, I think there are a lot of synergies in terms of, as we said, for the intent. And I think, culturally, there's a lot of alignment between America and Australia. And you have a fairly similar legal system. You both have lots of multinational companies that are operating across both fields. So from that kind of economic and social basis, there's immediate synergies there, and we share a rich history and heritage together. And I think going to that comment I said before, absolutely the intent is there. If you look at the Australian government's technology roadmap and what states like California or at the federal level in the US are trying to achieve, it's all aligned. And I think, as Vanessa said, climate change is a global challenge. And so when we start to look at this collaboration, it's just not only potentially collaboration between Australia and the US, but what can we do together to also export some of that innovation to other countries, such as in the Pacific, where there's a lot of collaboration going on as well. I suppose one of my perspectives around this is having probably traveled in the US for the majority of January for the first time in a couple of years, is for an Australian company in a kind of high growth scenario looking into the US market, how diverse the country actually is. What's happening in California at the state level and some of the things you have to navigate around that are far different from what you might have to navigate, let's just say, about installing energy storage into New York, where there's a lot of concerns around lithium-based and some rules around that even non-lithium companies have to navigate. So I suppose one of my learning lessons about that process is for a company that's on a high growth trajectory, actually focus in the US market is incredibly important to be successful and gaining that traction. On the other side, I would recognize that we've had some incredible support both at the state and federal level as we start to expand our strategy and operations into the US in terms of support from the US government about sourcing strategic materials in the US. We do find that, operating across a number of US government institutions, there really is that willingness to get behind, this clean energy initiative that's been clearly driven by President Biden.
That's great. Well, it sounds like you had a good visit, although you chose the wrong month, January. You should be in Australia in your summertime and alternate that. Just a quick follow-up there. Do you have any other, is there a couple of things that really surprised you about your visit in any one of these states? And is there a state that you are more likely to be more interested in for business after this trip?
Look, we're very excited about the opportunity in California. I think there's a big drive there, and clearly they have some regulations that are really driving that emphasis on deployment of renewable energy. Look, we think Texas also is a great opportunity for us. I mean, clearly last year was a pretty brutal reflection and exercise in their structure, and we think there's great opportunities for our battery system there. But look at a macro level, I think one of the key takeaways that I took was, people are now starting to look beyond probably lithium-based solutions into the market. We see a real drive in the US and in recognition at the policy level and the individual level at state level about sort of medium to longer term energy storage duration. Now we've got, as renewable energy starts to penetrate and get sort of 50, 60, 70%, the emphasis there is moving from kind of power-orientated energy storage to how can you shift that energy effectively and efficiently. And getting to that transition of maximizing renewable energy in the ecosystem is going to require that. And so, real active support for that we're seeing as a key thematic coming through, which is great for us and our business, and some really active support by, the US Secretary of Energy and at the state level in terms of flow batteries and the opportunity that's before us there.
That's great. I want to dive into storage technology even deeper in a couple of minutes. So keep those thoughts top of mind. And then this next question, I would love to direct at you first, Vanessa. But the Energy Department's Earthshot initiative and Australia's stretch goals under its long-term emissions roadmap both aim to reduce what I would like to think Bill, our founder, coined as the green premium, which is the cost differential between greener technologies and their dirtier fossil fuel-based counterparts. And so both these goals and policies at DOE and within Australia are aiming to reduce this green premium so more people and countries will adopt these technologies and get us to net zero. Vanessa, can you explain how DOE's Earthshot initiative and perhaps similar ones in other places could help achieve this transition by bringing down the cost?
Yeah, great question. Through the Energy Earthshots initiative, our department is setting ambitious but achievable targets to really transform key technologies within the decade. And you nailed it, which is all about lowering costs, but also raising performance, creating new jobs, and really clearing the way to our clean energy goals. And the reason why these Earthshots are so important, it's really an all hands on deck call for innovation to make sure the ecosystem is collaborating, and together we're accelerating our clean energy economy by tackling the toughest barriers that are remaining to really deploy our clean energy technologies at scale. And so to meet these targets, what DOE is doing right now is leveraging diverse expertise and talent at the US universities, businesses, national labs, and really trying to get us to accelerate research and development in the top linchpin technologies. And we've been holding a series of stakeholder engagement events that we're calling our Energy Earthshot Summits. So we announced our very first Earthshot, which was the hydrogen shot. And that was announced in June of 2021. And it set a very ambitious yet achievable cost target to get us to $1 per kilogram in a decade. And it's really, the goal is to spur demand of clean hydrogen and reduce the cost by 80%. We then had the second Energy Earthshot, which is long duration storage, and all of us know why this is important. And that was announced in July, a month later. And what we're trying to get to is affordable grid storage for clean power, so that anytime, anywhere, we're able to access that. And we need to do that by reducing the cost of grid scale energy storage by 90% for systems that deliver 10 plus hours of duration within the decade. And then the third energy shot that was announced was the carbon negative shot. And that was announced in November. And this is an all hands on deck call for innovation technologies and approaches that are going to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably store it at meaningful scales for less than $100 per net metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And so these initiatives are aimed to give targets out there so we can get down the cost curve, because we get down the cost curve, we don't have to worry about the green premium. And they're really modeled in part on the very successful Sunshot initiative. And so in September 2017, DOE had announced that the Sunshot initiative should get to a utility cost target of 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And they hit that 3 years earlier than expected. So these targets work, they're a call to action, and they're putting everyone on the same page of this is where we need to get to wide scale deployment.
That's great. Tim, I would love to hear your perspective as somebody in this the sector, private sector of energy storage. How do you see bringing down the green premium there?
Oh, look, it's so exciting to hear what Vanessa's talking about those moonshots, because that gives everyone just a target that everyone can aim for, which is really important from where we stand. I think it was in Bill Gates's book, he kind of cites the fact that gasoline on a price parity basis is cheaper than a can of soda. And so, your ability to kind of create an ecosystem and infrastructure that's going to enable that, if that's our benchmark, that's going to take a huge amount of effort across government and across the industry sectors. But it's achievable. and as long as we have the support of people like the DOE and those kind of moonshot bases that kind of points to the true north, what we're all trying to aim for, that's incredibly important. From our perspective, our battery is an aqueous-based solution that uses zinc and bromine and uses HDPE. So we believe the cost curve that we can get down to is tremendously exciting as we kind of start to scale up. And the fact that we've got one of the highest energy densities of kind of non-lithium solutions in the market means that, your balancer system cost to be able to go and deliver that solution to where it's needed most is incredibly attractive as well. So, just in summary, I suppose we all love a moonshot. The Americans got people onto the moon, so there's no reason why they can't achieve this multiple times over, given some of those targets. But I think, for us, it's about going along that continuum, scaling up our system and getting the support from both the private sector in terms of investment, but also some clear signals from government that we're on the right pathway to solving some of these big policy challenges and sort of infrastructure challenges that are before us.
Great, thank you. I think one thing that sets these Earth shots and moonshots apart from the actual moonshot is that we're facing an incredibly shortened time frame of when we need to achieve all of this. And so, Linda, a question for you is, given this urgency that we can't just let innovation happen at the pace that it would happen anyways, absent more concerted action, what is your experience at NSF and before? Like, what's the recipe for success to expedite this process for commercialization?
I'll make a couple comments on that. First, that's the whole premise for the Convergence Accelerator, which is a 3-year program where you spend 1 year in a planning grant phase, preparing and going through customer discovery and through our curriculum for team science and leadership and figuring out what to focus on for those 2 years of accelerated convergence research. But I would also add the thing that we want to keep in mind, we're very big on talking about partnerships, because the only way to really move at speed and scale is to access what you don't have through partnerships. And that could be, as Tim alluded to earlier, sometimes that little startup company can't take the time to go back and do some fundamental research that they need, but perhaps they can access that through an academic partner. And the point that I want to make is it's very exciting. We have these urgent things to be solved. Got great resources at DOE that have focused goals and these lofty goals. As we move towards this path, a lot of those things should fail. We should be doing high risk work. If we really want to reach the high goals, a lot of that research, applied research, should fail. Well, I think what we really need to also focus on is capturing that research and understanding what we've learned from where that technology has been limited in its application, where we need to go back and do fundamental research so that we can be better prepared as we move forward in these new technical areas. But this is the whole premise of the Convergence Accelerator, is to try and create this cultural shift in all the fundamental research. And we don't just fund things in that program that come from NSF funded work. We're agnostic as to whether or not that foundational research was funded by DOE or DOD or was funded by Australia.
If I can add to that, I mean, I think that as part of this challenge, it's always good to learn from the past. And I think taking some of the lessons that we saw around the first kind of clean tech boom in the kind of mid to late 2000s is also instructive upon the community here. If we look back at that period, there was some strong government support, there was cheap capital, gas was expensive, which is also another input, and some strong private sector and government support. But really, I think where it fell down was that kind of appreciation, particularly around the VC community, that solving clean tech challenges is perhaps not the same as a software-based solution that drove a lot of value for a lot of those companies in the 2000s. And I think there's that appreciation that to really solve this challenge, you need manufacturing, you need billions of dollars and years in the saddle around operational experience, so you can perfect these technologies and enable them to kind of scale up. And that's why I think this time is different, that people are kind of learning from that experience and actually saying, this stuff is hard, it's going to take time, it's going to take money and effort, and it's going to take that coordinated approach to be able to go and solve those issues. And I think that's recognized by people like Breakthrough Ventures and other organizations along with the public sector to say, we need to stick at this for a long time, but we know that there's a deadline around 2040 that we need to solve. So, focus, support, deadlines, and a holistic view about to solve this, I think are kind of going to be the successful ingredients for us to move forward.
That's great. And it's a good segue. Oh, were you going to say something, Linda?
No, just having lived through, been in the San Francisco Bay Area from the early 2000s and lived through that, I couldn't agree more. There was some naivete, and having spent some of my career in the biotech field as well, similar happenings there, but we're in a much different place now. And I'm very encouraged very optimistic actually, by the sense of urgency that I see felt around the world, at least now with the plastics problem. We have huge international efforts going on. We have UNEA 5.2 happening right now. It's very exciting.
And I would say even with the public companies, right? It's really interesting right now. All the big companies now have chief sustainability officers. That role did not even exist 5 years ago, right? And I've spoken to many of them. They're like, "This is great. We've made these commitments. I have no idea how I'm going to get there, but we've made them. We're going to get there." And so I just think there's a wind of change that I haven't seen across the entire ecosystem. That's really exciting.
And the chief diversity officer role also relatively new and extremely relevant, because we need to develop these solutions in an equitable way.
So kind of building on what you just said, Vanessa, of course, the private sector investment in climate tech has been growing rapidly. Records are broken pretty much every quarter. And this is happening both across the realm of different types of investment firms. But yet, as you said, Vanessa, there's still this gap between goals and intention and actually doing things that are going to get us to these goals. Many of you may be familiar with the Breakthrough Energy Catalyst program that's really helping to try to bridge that divide between companies' intent to help address climate change and commercializing some of these important technologies. So maybe Vanessa, go to you first. Like, how could the Energy Department help these companies really actualize on their goals?
Yeah, so, my department, OTT, the Office of Technology Transitions, is a good example of the role that government can play in this transition, because we're really trying to foster commercialization outcomes from our lab investments. And so it's not really about balancing with the private sector. It's really about each of us doing their part. And so from the US government perspective, with the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, it's a historic investment that's being made to bring these technologies to market. It includes $62 billion for DOE, and it's going to stand up 60 new DOE programs, including 16 demonstration and 32 deployment programs, and expanding funding for 12 existing research development demonstration deployment programs. So demonstration deployment was not, something that we were thinking about as programmatically as we are now. And as you think about it, right, ultimately it's making these major investments in supply chains for advanced batteries. Example of that is, $7 billion being awarded to it, which will be critical to modernizing the electric grid and supporting high-level clean energy deployment. And all of that is going to be important for the private sector. We look at the $16 billion to upgrade and modernize our electric grid to make it more resilient to extreme weather and resistance to cyber attacks. And there's more than $22 billion for clean energy demonstration and research hubs. Those hubs are going to be made up of the private sector and getting us to next generation technologies to achieve our net zero goal by 2050. And so I know that's, I talk a lot about funding, but, it's really more than that. The infrastructure law is going to help us remedy energy and environmental, justice issues for the communities. And that's something that Linda had talked about as well. We have to make sure that across the country, we're thinking about environmental injustice and fixing it. And we're taking a lot of needed steps to improve public health, reduce pollution, and really develop the economic revitalization we need in these communities that for too long have been way underserved and disproportionately burdened by pollution. And so I'm really excited about the role the government can play to activate the communities and the private sector.
Absolutely. I just want to jump in on it, direct you, if you follow our DCL link that was dropped in the chat earlier, you'll see a workshop report on socio-resilient infrastructure. Christine Ortiz and Ellen Spiro at MIT and Station One would be very interesting to look at in that regard. And I also dropped in the chat, Vanessa, you may, and a shout out to Breakthrough Energy Ventures. So Clear Flame, before I was with the Convergence Accelerator, this was an SBIR, NSF funded startup company. This technology came out of Stanford. Julie Bloomreiter and BJ Johnson are the co-founders. However, they moved to Illinois, Chicago, Illinois, to be near Argonne National Lab to really get that company going. And then they had the financing secured from Breakthrough. So that's really just shows that sort of concerted cooperation between government resources and funding, and then moving to venture capital can be very effective.
That's so great. And this has been a good segue to, I would like to bring up just a couple of audience questions that we received ahead of time. And Vanessa, you touched on this a little bit, so perhaps you can expound upon that, but also would love to hear from Linda and Tim. How can we ensure that equity in funding opportunities, how can we ensure that there's equity in both funding opportunities and also encouraging diversity of ideas and people in this space as we have this massive transition to new sources of energy?
Yeah, so great and a very important question. So diversity, equity, inclusion are key priorities, not only for my office, but for the Department of Energy and for the Biden administration as a whole. And one example of how, where in the US we're trying to do this is in the Energy Program for Innovation Clusters. This is a program that I fund EPIC, where we are looking to provide funding to encourage the robust growth of regional energy innovation ecosystems across the US. And many of our awardees have shared their commitments to leverage funds to help advance their equity work, to help support underrepresented groups in the startup and innovation ecosystems. And so we're doing a lot to integrate this as a focus directly into our programs. And the key thing is that we really have the leadership to go do this, right? And to think about this more programmatically. Shalonda Baker is a colleague of mine, and she's been leading a lot of the work around economic diversity and ensuring that we have energy justice. And there's been several working groups across our agencies and across the White House that's really looking to ensure that 40% of our impact is going after these underserved communities. So everything that we do, from the FOAs that we're releasing to the prizes that we're running to the programs that we have like EPIC, we're making sure we're thinking about diversity and economic diversity and looking to just energy impact in everything that we do. And so this is going to be something that you'll continue to see coming out of this administration. I think it's super critical if we're going to drive to the change we want to see.
Absolutely. DEIA is part of the DNA of NSF. It's actually written into our evaluation criteria for our proposals alongside intellectual merit. We talk about broader impacts. So it's super important to what we do at NSF. And I would just comment, I think the one way to really help this is to have more women and underrepresented folks as venture capitalists on the investment side, to come to NSF and DOE and be program directors, and that diversity then brings diversity in the reviewers that review our work and the applicants that we select for our proposals.
That's great. I would love to direct the next audience question to Tim, given it's more about Australia. What pragmatic steps in the moment is Australia taking towards a net zero economy in 2030? Now, that may not happen. It's 8 years, but certainly that doesn't mean there shouldn't be an effort. So can you talk about that?
Look, I think from my perspective, you know, if you actually look what's going on in Australia, you know, there's been a lot of progress on the renewable energy agenda. I think the country achieved about 30% renewables last year. In some states in South Australia, they achieved 100% renewable energy. So, you know, while you know, there's discussions at the federal level about you know, commitments to the Paris Agreement, I see when you look underneath that, actually things are happening, and are actually happening in a pretty substantive way. You know, 1 in 4 households now in Australia have solar, which I think is one of the largest of anywhere in the world, and that's creating, I think, great opportunities, but great challenges of, you know, how do you manage energy that's being generated at the edge? Can you start to think in a fresh way about remote communities and microgrids and how you enable that, especially when you're seeing the cost of renewables start to decline. And I think the government has been very clear in terms of its technology investment roadmap that it expects new technologies to come around and to be scalable. That's going to help achieve its renewable energy goals. So look, I'm pretty excited from where we sit today. There's a lot of work to do, but I certainly feel that what is going and what is being implemented at the ground, at the state level in Australia especially, is very exciting. On top of that, you've got the institutions like ARENA in Australia and the Clean Energy Finance Corp that are orientated towards supporting companies to scale up and help achieve some of those goals. The only thing I would say that's kind of slightly different to that is don't underestimate the power of the private sector. The private sector, I think, is going to be one of the leaders in pushing governments to go and put the right frameworks and initiatives in place to achieve their own corporate goals. And we were talking to a very large corporate in the US before who has said, I want to make sure that every electron I use is green, and I can audit my electricity use to be able to go and validate that to my shareholders. That's a really, I think, seismic shift from the corporate point of view, that's sort of saying, I'm committed to this journey and I want to have the enabling environment that is going to help me achieve my goals. That's at a government level, at utility level, and at the private sector as well.
That's so great. Well, we are in our final minutes, and as a sort of a concluding comment and question, I would love to, we've touched on a couple of energy technologies today, but we have a lot more that we didn't talk about. The important role of how to manage the decline of fossil fuels and to what degree those should be penalized to incentivize clean energy. But in my final question, I'd love to ask each of you to name one technology that maybe we haven't brought up yet today, and talk about why you're excited about it. Linda, maybe I'll have you go first.
Given that we have a new funding opportunity coming, I'm not going to get specific, but I'm going to say the folks that can come and develop new materials that are both sustainable for the environment and for human beings on this earth, and also address areas that are of importance, such as national security areas. I think folks that can come up with that sort of meta research or solution that then helps the rest of the community to build on developing materials in a sustainable way is what's really going to help mitigate climate change as we move forward.
That's great. Tim, I suppose one of your favorite technologies would be energy storage, but if you had another one that we haven't talked about that you think is worth mentioning.
Well, I'm pretty biased towards flow batteries and their role in the ecosystem. Maybe I'll kind of answer that in a different way, is I think the thematic of sustainability and recycling, I think, is going to become more and more important. So, if we develop great solutions, how is it developed? How is it produced? But also at its end of life, what happens next? And I think, new technologies and solutions that can come along that can help solve that problem. So it doesn't mean that, we're creating a huge overhang of disposal and recycling costs, etc., is actually going to be the winner. Look, there's a number of exciting things coming along in that pathway, but I certainly feel that that's going to be a more and more important message, both at the government level, the research level, and at the private sector as well.
That's great. Vanessa?
I love all my clean technologies equally, just like I love all my children equally, and I'm like gunning for all of them. And I think kind of going to this theme it's really around, in my mind, taking a look at your portfolio of all the energy technologies that you have and asking yourself, for different applications, which one is more likely to win, and making sure that we're honing ourselves in and guiding those technologies to go after the end use applications that make the most sense for that technology. And I think sometimes we take more of a let's make sure, hydrogen or this other, type of technology is going to solve everything, but maybe we should start focus and paring down and thinking about that. And so I have a lot of excitement around the entire portfolio of things that we're doing, because I'll be honest, I've looked at this in many different ways, many different cuts. We need all of them. We need every single one of them. We need nuclear, we need hydrogen, we need batteries, we need everything, solar, wind, all of it. So I really can't say I want to favor one of them because I need all of them to work. But that's why it's so fun right now is we have chief sustainability officers, we have foundations, we have VC money, we have private sector, we have startups, we have all these people right now with a groundswell trying to make all the technologies work. So I'm not going to play favoritism. I want them all to work, but I think the theme is here, which is we need to commercialize quickly. We need to commercialize with a lot of forethought, and we have to work together, right? Across countries, across the ecosystem. And the more we do that, the faster we'll be able to turn this thing around. So that's, my cop-out answer, but I love them all.
I think that's a great answer, and it's a wonderful note to end this great panel on. So I want to say a big thank you to the panelists and to the audience for tuning in, no matter where you may be in this world. And I'll now hand things over to Aaron Gray from the American Australian Association for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to all our fantastic panelists. Wow, what a really great panel. I feel like we need a part two. I think we could have kept going for another hour easily. So on behalf of the American Australian Association, I want to thank all of you for tuning in today. As we navigate our way through this post-COVID world, we'll continue to host these important and topical webinars, as well as in-person events aimed at showcasing and strengthening the great US-Australia relationship. You can keep up to date on upcoming events and find past replays and past events, including the one today, will be up on our website tomorrow by visiting our website at americanaustralian.org. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks again to all our amazing panelists. Good night.